nice to be here with all of you this afternoon. I'm honored by the faces that stuck around. It must have meant the first presentation wasn't too horrible. So thank you for staying for presentation number 2, and it's nice to see some new faces in the room. I want to start off really quickly before I talk a little bit about Policy Research Associates and what we do, just like I did with the last presentation, so this will be a repeat for some of you. But just real quickly, if you would say your first name, where you're from, and what you do with the treatment court system, that would be great. Again, just so I have a better idea of who I'm talking to as I deliver this presentation. Vicki, would you start?
Sure. My name is Vicki. I'm from the Gallatin County Treatment Court Program. I'm the clinical coordinator, and my credentials include LCSW and LAC.
Excellent. You can come up and do the presentation then. Thank you. We've got a psychologist in the back of the room too, so he will be.
We're on the same team.
Okay.
My name is Tom. I'm a certified mental health professional and crisis response therapist in Missoula.
My name is Brenda, and I preside over the Missoula Co-occurring Court and the Missoula Veterans Court.
I'm Hannah Halton. I'm the coordinator for the Veteran and Co-occurring Treatment Court in Missoula.
Excellent. Thank you.
I'm Lisa. I'm an LAC and an LCPC, and I work at the Billings Municipal Treatment Court.
Great.
I'm Paul. I'm MSW LAC, work with Missoula Youth Treatment Court.
Wonderful.
Elena, LAC, Custer County Treatment.
Kayla, Sydney with Sequential Drug Court, and I'm a licensed addiction counselor.
Thank you.
Brooke, I'm with the 9th District. I'm the coordinator.
I remember you were the 9th district.
Valerie, I'm in Great Falls with the Adult Drug Court and the Veterans Court, and I do a little of everything.
Thank you.
And that's a relative of mine after the fact, Vicki.
I'm Jim. I'm a psychologist at the Gallatin County Treatment Court.
Thank you.
I'm Denny. I'm not with the treatment court. I'm with Senator Steve Daines, Bipolar.
Great. Thank you.
Danny Williams with the Great Falls Veterans Treatment Court and Drug Treatment Court.
Mona Sumner. I'm currently an evaluator for a number of the drug courts.
Excellent. Thank you.
Becky, I'm case manager for Treatment Court in Glasgow.
And the mayor.
Yes.
Don't forget the mayor.
I'm the mayor.
Marie, Missoula County Justice of the Peace, and then I preside over Co-occurring Court and Veterans Court when Brenda's out of town.
My name is Audrey. Hill County Justice Court of Record, preside over Hill County District Court, or Hill County Drug Court, Hill County DUI Court, and we take both felony and misdemeanor offenders.
Great.
I'm Carolyn. I'm an LAC with the Hill County Treatment Court.
I'm Alexandra, and I work with the coordinators of the Billings, Camo, and Steer Board.
Wonderful.
Hi, I'm Suzanne. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner with Hill County Drug Court.
Thank you.
I'm Alana with the 1316 Judicial Treatment Court and the coordinator.
Sandy with Billings Municipal Court, co-occurring court coordinator.
Excellent. Thank you all for doing that. I really appreciate it. And it's nice to see, I know the focus of the conference is it's a drug court conference, but it's also nice to see that there's representation from other specialty courts, from veterans courts. I think earlier today we heard about mental health courts, co-occurring disorders courts, so it's nice to see a large gamut of courts run, because if there's one thing there's a lot of things that we know, but one of the things that we know, especially when it comes to specialty courts, is just the prevalence of co-occurring disorders within those courts, and sometimes the challenges that go into either how do you properly screen and assess and direct a person to the right court, or if you don't necessarily have the perfect court for them to go into, how do you work with people that have multiple issues that are justice involved? Because obviously the more issues that a person has, from substance use disorders to mental health disorders to trauma issues to be justice involved, the more complex the solutions tend to be. And so I know just from listening to many of you, there's a lot of you in the room that have very significant clinical backgrounds and are no strangers to this work. So I'm also going to look to you in your experience to also chime in during this presentation, especially if you hear something up here that triggers an aha moment. I've worked with a person that's being described up here that can provide a nice illustration of folks that you're working with day in and day out here in the state of Montana. So, Policy Research Associates. my work history, as you heard earlier, spans from working in the state prison system in Nebraska to being the deputy director of county mental health, which also included starting up our state's first behavioral health jail diversion program, where it was the first opportunity back in 2003 for our county mental health system to team up with our county jail and really provide post-booking diversion opportunities for people with behavioral health disorders that we knew could be better served, and that if they were connected with the right treatments and supports and services, had a really good chance of either staying in the community without recidivating back in, or drastically reducing their recidivism rates into the justice system. And it's really important, you know, as we talk about the folks that we're serving in specialty courts, that we understand that success is defined differently for everyone. I know when we started up our jail diversion program, in my own naivety, I thought, you know, one of our biggest allies is going to be the public defender's office in our county, and and that certainly ended up not being the case. And it wasn't the fault of the public defender, but our elected county attorney had said, look, this is something that's foreign to Lincoln, Nebraska. This is something that's new, and so because it's new, the only people that we're going to look at diverting here initially are persons with behavioral health disorders that have committed low-level offenses. So low-level misdemeanors that were primarily nuisance offenses. And the public defender then came and said, well, look, you know what, my role here is to work with my clients and give them good legal advice. And so why in the world would I tell somebody when they could sit something out in jail for 7 to 10 days that they should go be a part of your program for 6 months? And so we really had to regroup then, and then go back to the public defender's office and say, okay, we're taking a look at some of the people who are coming through. And you know what, in the last 3 years, this person was your client 35 times. Now, what if they were only your client 5 times over the next 3 years? Would that be defined as success for that person? And that's really where the discussion started in terms of how we began to try to better serve people that were justice involved with behavioral health disorders in our community. And so I've had the chance for the last decade, first as a consultant, but now as a full-time staff member, to go out and do training and technical assistance, which sometimes is trauma trainings or sequential intercept mappings, where we take a look at how people with behavioral health disorders typically have contact with law enforcement as a first point of entry into the justice system, and then what does that community look like as a person is booked into jail, as they move their way into the court system, as they then look at re-entry into the community, and that may be under the supervision of probation or parole, and then what types on the back end, when they're back in the community, what types of services and supports are available for things like housing and entitlements and things like that, which are all very important to folks who are involved in treatment courts. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go throughout this presentation this afternoon. So we've been doing this work for 30 years at Policy Research Associates. We have multiple training and technical assistance centers under the umbrella of our parent company. One of them is the SAMHSA Gain Center for Behavioral Health and Justice Transformation, where we have a contract with SAMHSA to go out into communities, do training and technical assistance like I just described. We also run the SOAR Technical Assistance Center. Or have any of you heard of SOAR before? Okay, so Social Security Outreach, Access, and Recovery, where people that are eligible for entitlements like SSI, SSDI, you know, typically what we see across the country is that first-time application approval rates are abysmal, somewhere around 20%. But when case managers and other staff have gone through SOAR training, typically that first-time approval rating goes up to 80 to 90% as a result of knowing how to fill that application out in the language that's being looked for. We run the National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice, as well as other technical assistance centers like the Service Members, Veterans, and Families, and also a peer support technical assistance center. So, again, it's an honor to be here with all of you, and I'm going to ask you to tap into some of your experiences today and your expertise as we go through this presentation together, because this is not what we're here to talk about. And I promise you at the end of this presentation, I've got all the slides, the presentation up here on the front table. I just wanted to wait until after we get done with this, so that way we can have more of a dialogue instead of kind of burying your head in the notes of the presentation. So that one is on there. That one is on there. You can feel free to use it liberally as you would like. So this is not here what we're here to talk about today. So if I were to ask you how far back you think people started to acknowledge that there are persons with significant mental health issues that are involved in the justice system and actually began documenting it. How many years back would you think that this has been an issue that people have recognized and actually written about?
Not very long.
Not very long, okay. Take a guess in terms of ballpark number of years. There is no
25.
prize. 25 years, okay.
That's a guess.
Okay. Who else?
15.
5.
400, okay. So we're really running the gamut, aren't we? Okay.
Thinking historically.
Thinking historically here, that's very good. What I want you to know in the slides that I'm about ready to show you is, I'm not saying the language that is used in these slides is okay to describe people with mental health issues. I want you to see the language that has been used for centuries, though, to describe this very common issue that we are talking about here today in this conference. In 1777, and I'm going to go through kind of chronologically here. In 1777, John Howard, a prison reformer, wrote, "I must here add that in so few prisons are confined idiots and lunatics. No care is taken of them, although it is probable that by medicines and proper regimens, some of them might be restored to their senses and to usefulness in life." So about as long as we've been a country. 159 years ago. "But the insane criminal has nowhere any home. No age or nation has provided a place for him. He is everywhere unwelcome and objectionable. The prisons thrust him out, the hospitals are unwilling to receive him, the law will not let him stay at his house, and the public will not permit him to go abroad. And yet humanity and justice, the sense of common danger, and a tender regard for a deeply degraded brother man, all agree that something should be done for him, that some plan must be devised different from and better than any that has been tried, by which he may be properly cared for, by which his malady may be healed, and his criminal propensity overcome." So the American Journal of Insanity in 1857. 60 years ago, in the publication called Social Problems, poor uneducated people appear to use the police in the way that middle-class people use family doctors and clergymen, that is, as the first port of call in a time of trouble. 60 years ago. 59 years ago, in the same publication, policemen confront perversion, disorientation, misery, irresoluteness, and incompetence much more often than any other social agent. We saw when President Kennedy signed the Mental Health Act of 1963, the idea was to shut down hospital beds, state hospital beds across the United States, and take those savings and pour them into community-based services and care. We know obviously that President Kennedy was assassinated, and there are a lot of arguments today as to, did this actually happen or not? I can tell you in Nebraska, it did not, and we are still in many ways paying the price for that lack of transition to community-based care, with a significant reduction in hospital beds where people whose acuity level is very high and they have criminal justice system or forensic involvement. There are struggles to know where is the best place to help this individual at, because they are in desperate need of help, but we don't have the right level of care to help meet their needs. So 1963 with the Community Mental Health Act. 17 years ago in the Bureau of Justice Assistance publication, when they started to take a look at how are justice-involved persons with serious mental illness different from persons with serious mental illness who are not involved in the criminal justice system. Okay, so folks with SMI that are justice involved, and folks with SMI that are not justice involved. And what are some of the key differences? Folks in the justice system are more likely to be homeless, more likely to have co-occurring disorders, more likely to use a greater variety of high-cost services, more likely to be unemployed, and more likely to have psychological impairment, including extensive histories of trauma that we talked about in the first presentation today for those of you that were in here. So what are some of the population characteristics of people who find their way into the justice system, and ultimately a lot of them become eligible for things like specialty courts, for treatment courts? We know that in the community, in the general population, we see a prevalence rate of persons with serious mental illness somewhere hovering around 4 to 5% in the community. When we move into the criminal justice system, we see that rate shoot up to 1 out of every 6, or roughly 17% of the folks that have a serious mental illness. Now I want you to think about that for a second. 1 out of every, wow, Siri just popped on while I was talking. 1 out of every 6 people that come into the justice system have a serious mental illness. think about other health disorders that people may encounter, whether that's heart disease or that's cancer. If we said that at least 1 out of every 6 people entering the justice system were dealing with some other significant, very significant health issue, we would certainly say that that means we need to turn our attention and our focus to that health issue to help people deal with it. Okay, and we know that as far back as 239 years ago, people started taking notice that there are folks with serious mental health issues that are involved in the justice system. Yet here we are in 2016, almost 2017, still talking about it and how do we best serve people. One of the things that we know is that we've created things like specialty courts to help people. But it's not the be-all to end-all. It's not the ultimate safety net for people. And again, we'll touch on this a little bit as we go through the presentation this afternoon. What we also see is that of the 17% of individuals that have a serious mental illness, roughly 3 out of every 4 of them are also dealing with a co-occurring substance use disorder. So persons with substance use disorders in the justice system, drug testing of arrestees shows that 4 out of every 5 come in testing positive for something. Okay? And that of the jail population with substance use disorders, about 7 out of every 10 individuals have a substance use disorder as they get booked in and come into the jail system. 46% of them with a substance use disorder only, and 22% with dually diagnosed substance use disorders and serious mental illness. These next 2 slides are going to be a repeat for those of you that attended the first session a little while ago. It's also important as we talk about specialty courts and mental health issues of people that are entering into drug courts and other specialty courts, that we also acknowledge that people have significant histories of trauma as they enter into those systems. Again, a very brief recap of this slide, especially for those of you that were here an hour ago. This was a study that we did at Policy Research Associates of 20 jail diversion sites across the country from 2002 to 2007 with 2,122 jail diversion participants. 2 things really surprised us here. We expected to see a fairly significant difference between men and women in terms of the prevalence rates of trauma histories. We did not see that. You can see that the rates were very close in terms of percentages of men and women dealing with significant histories of trauma. We were also very surprised when we took a look at rates within the last 12 months of individuals that were involved in those jail diversion programs that were dealing with 1 or more significant traumatic issues in their life: sexual assault, physical assault, mental emotional abuse, in the year leading up to that arrest that led into their involvement in the jail diversion program. So while we know that trauma was in the past for many of the folks that were entering into the jail system, the court system, and the jail diversion system, it was also ongoing for so many of the folks that were becoming involved in the program and being diverted. With the mental health court study that we did across 3 states and 311 mental health court participants, we saw that roughly 2 out of every 3 men and women that were mental health court participant involvements dealt with child physical abuse, and that roughly 1 out of every 3 within the last 12 months of their mental health court involvement had dealt with physical and sexual abuse in their lives. And so again, I'm going to use a phrase that I used an hour ago. It's important to make a universal assumption that the folks that you are working with in your specialty courts have histories of trauma, which in turn we know leads to multiple and often significant mental health issues that those persons are dealing with, that you are working with day in and day out. Okay, so it's very important to make that universal assumption of trauma. So what are some of the defining characteristics of mental illness? I'm just going to run through these real fast because you're working with individuals on a daily basis where you see the manifestation of a lot of these. There's clinical significant behavioral problems. So we see behavior that may be bizarre, may be inappropriate, may be illegal, may be dangerous. We see those mental health systems that can manifest themselves in behavioral problems. They are associated with distress. Oftentimes people that are dealing with serious mental health issues don't enjoy it. It's distressful for them in their lives. It causes anxiety. It causes problems. It causes disability, such as impairment in their functioning daily. It's a biological illness that responds to treatment, and it's not to be confused with weakness of character. And the reason that I've got this one up here is that I can't tell you, and I'm not pointing fingers at any certain discipline in the justice system that I've worked with throughout the years, But it wouldn't be uncommon at times when I was working in the segregation unit, whether it was a men or a women's prison, where we had somebody who would chronically be in segregation. And it was very obvious that the behaviors that led to the infractions that brought them into segregation were directly tied to significant mental health issues that the person was dealing with. And there were times when staff within the prison setting would make a comment like, man, they're so weak, if they would just snap out of it. You know, if they would just realize what they're doing is causing these problems. And it was difficult sometimes in the frustration of the moment, or moments, as the case were for a lot of people, to really take all of these factors into account and realize most oftentimes it has nothing to do with a weakness in a person. It's with the ability to cope and survive and function, especially in a criminal justice setting or on the streets. If somebody is involved in a specialty court and they're living in the community and don't have all the necessary services and supports that are in place that most of us take for granted from day to day. Some facts about mental illness. Sorry. Mental illness has nothing to do with a person's intelligence. We've all heard about people throughout history that have dealt with significant mental health issues. Einstein, we've seen movies like A Beautiful Mind, where Russell Crowe's character deals with very serious psychosis. It can happen to anyone, whether that's a biological predisposition to depression or schizophrenia, or even as we talked about in the last presentation, to being susceptible to trauma. That it's chronic most oftentimes. Serious mental illnesses are chronic, but they're not contagious. Okay? There's nothing wrong with being in contact with a person who has a significant mental health issue. Sometimes it can be very difficult to diagnose and to treat, and oftentimes it can be treated, but typically not cured, especially when we look at chronic mental health issues versus situational. You know, sometimes we've all, especially if you've got a clinical background, we can think of times where we worked with somebody who maybe is suffering from situational depression. Maybe they're experiencing symptoms of depression related to a divorce or the breakup of a relationship that is having a significant impact on their life, but as they move through time and gain some coping skills around that, they're able to function in a much improved manner. Whereas persons that have chronic and serious and clinically significant depression or something like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, we see that people are treated but typically not cured. And so we take a recovery-based focus, realizing that recovery looks different for every person. Just like I talked about with that jail diversion example early on, we have to define what recovery and success looks like individually for everybody in terms of our ability to function and carry out those activities of daily living day in and day out. Persons with mental illness are not typically dangerous, and that's a huge myth. It kind of sparks a trigger in me when we hear news stories about how this person had serious mental health issues or that person. What we know is that by and large, people that have mental health problems, mental health issues, mental health diagnoses, if treated, they're no more violent than you and I are. Okay? That's why proper treatment is important. Proper screening, assessment, and direction into treatment and recognition of what's going on with the person. And it should not be confused with terms like psychopath or sociopath. Why is that? What's the difference between somebody who has a significant mental health issue as opposed to something that we label as a person with psychopathy or they're a sociopath? What's the difference there? We got enough clinical people in the room. Somebody speak. I mean, I keep staring at the psychologist.
Well, they're treatable for one.
Okay. And what's typically really the term psychopath or sociopath reaches the pinnacle of our highest label of someone in the criminal justice system. And what do they typically do to achieve that label? Or what's the differentiation between somebody that's labeled as being a sociopath or a psychopath as opposed to somebody who's got schizophrenia or
It's systematic and a pattern behavior of involving extreme violence or acting out with seemingly lack of moral compass.
Absolutely. And it can oftentimes be difficult for a person who has sociopathy or is a psychopath to really experience emotions like you and I do. I often refer to it as somebody who's at a stoplight but they're colorblind. They've learned over time that Red means stop, but they're not able to see the red. So they can talk about what emotions feel like for you and me without typically experiencing those emotions for themselves. Okay, so a genuine disregard and a lack of emotional connection, even to people that we would think that they would be close to. So general signs and manifestations of mental illnesses, especially as we look into the justice system and folks that you would be working with within the treatment court setting. We know that oftentimes the manifestations of mental illness can be observable. We can see that in the behaviors that we talked about earlier. There may be confusion or disorientation. Somebody who's experiencing a psychotic disorder, we may see those darting looks or talking to themselves. And as you run down the list here of poor hygiene, how oftentimes do we see that within the justice system? Whether it's in the treatment court setting, in the jail setting, somebody that you may be supervising out in the community, inappropriate attire for the weather. I knew the guys that I was working with in the prison system. You know, there were some people that would be out on the prison yard wearing their heavy winter coats for safety reasons, but there were other guys who were out there that were dressed completely inappropriately for the weather or the situation as a result of the symptoms of their mental health issues. And it wasn't all that difficult at times to differentiate who was who out on the prison yard. We see behavior changes, flat affect, withdrawn from other people, that anxiety, that panic, and you may be thinking of people right now that you're working with in your specialty course that have come in through drug court, through veterans court, through a mental health court, a DUI court, whatever that might look like, that have exhibited some of the symptoms of mental health issues and the challenges that you face in terms of helping them manage in the community so that they're not recidivating back into the justice system. Some of the volatile behavior and difficulty with following directions that we see with people in specialty courts related to substance use issues as well as mental health issues. Oftentimes on the left-hand side here with substance use, we see impulsive behavior, reduced inhibitions due to being under the influence of substances, withdrawal, co-occurring disorders. I can't tell you the number of times, and this is very difficult, especially as people transition their way from arrest to the jail, into the court setting, and into treatment courts, where a person has gotten that far into the court setting because a law enforcement officer said, you know what, I knew that this person needed help, and I needed to either keep them safe, or they needed to detox, or they needed to get connected to treatment, but I didn't know where to take them. I didn't have a place to take them in the community, and I needed to know that they were going to be safe and that they were going to get help, so I had no other choice but to take them into the jail and book them in on some minor offense or something that a person without a behavioral health disorder wouldn't have been booked into jail on. And so we see a lot of people that continue to penetrate into the justice system as a result of their co-occurring disorders or as a result of their mental health issues. And by the same token, on the right-hand side here, some of those volatile behaviors and difficulty with following directions when we're dealing with folks that have significant mental health issues, not attending to directions out of fear, out of paranoia that they experience, a fear that I'm encroaching on your personal space, and space being a very critical issue sometimes for persons that have significant mental health issues. As a result of traumatic experiences, having a fear of authority, of being confined in a small space, of having restraints placed on you, because sometimes that history of trauma is directly related to being restrained, being confined, being in a position of submission to others, and having some cognitive difficulties directly tied into serious mental health issues. So what are some of the challenges for the person that has a significant mental health issue? Complying with the conditions of release. Folks that are involved in treatment courts, oftentimes I'm assuming that if they are involved in your court, they have agreed to some condition or conditions of compliance and treatment in the community. And it can be very difficult as a result of the cyclical nature of mental health issues to comply with conditions of release. Engaging with other people that you are bringing in for support or supervision. Again, if there's panic, if there's fear, if there's anxiety, fear of working with people in positions of authority, getting them engaged with other community corrections partners, whether that's supervision under probation, can be a real challenge as you introduce more and more partners into their lives. Communication difficulties and following directions. How many of you see some of these issues in the folks that you're working with in your treatment courts? A large number of you? Are there any individuals that are really sticking out? A story about that, you don't have to identify the person, but a story about that person in your work with them that really illustrates some of what we're talking about today. Don't be shy, it's okay. We're all friends.
We had a fellow who, just the stresses of learning how to try to complete the tasks that were required in treatment court, along with being taken off of all of the medications that were addictive, he became highly suicidal. Every week I would get on my voicemail a suicidal statement. I'm going to kill myself today. And then there was all of the follow-up that goes along with someone who's suicidal and assessing them in terms of services and connecting. It was very time-consuming. He's doing amazing right now.
Excellent, excellent. And so, what we start to realize, and I'm going to start to kind of encroach upon this in a few slides here, is that regardless of what piece of the criminal justice system that you're working in, you guys, as I talk to you here in a minute about the sequential intercept model, you're going to see that most of you on a daily basis, it's smack dab in the middle of what we call Intercept 3, okay, working in the specialty court setting. But oftentimes what we lose sight of is the importance of partnerships with people who work outside of our Intercept or our environment, because in most specialty courts, if you or your staff are not providing the direct supervision, you're linking people with something like a probation officer in the community. It's also really important in times of crisis, if you're not available 24/7, is do you have a relationship with mobile crisis response, with crisis response teams, where they can assist law enforcement, or there's a flagging system that says, hey, you know what, this person's in drug court, or this person's in veterans court. They're also connected with a VJO or a Veterans Justice Outreach worker. And really having that system of supports and professionals and peers working together to help keep that person in the community, especially when acuity levels are high in that individual. So it's really important to think outside of, when you're working with somebody inside of a treatment court setting, who are the partners that we are either involved with that we need to bring in more, or who are new partners that a lot of our folks could really benefit from contact with when they're struggling in the community, in order to help people maintain in the community. So some of the challenges and risks, like we just heard about. Suicide risks. And how do we help people when they are indicating that they are suicidal or at risk for suicide? Things like the masking of mental illness by substance use. When I was working at the women's prison in York, and this would have been in York, Nebraska, this would have been back in the late 90s. One of my responsibilities was to go to our diagnostic and evaluation center and do an initial assessment and psychological testing. And when I was interviewing inmates as they were coming into the women's prison, I was floored, and I talked to our psychologist about this. I said, I can't believe the number of women that are entering our prison right now that have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. The prevalence rate was through the roof, and I didn't get it. And so when I would be doing these assessments and doing these interviews, I would ask people, well, who diagnosed you with bipolar disorder? And oftentimes it would come back, well, my physician, my family practitioner, et cetera. And what we started to learn over time as we dug deeper into people's histories is that there were many women who were experiencing the symptoms of bipolar disorder. A family member would be concerned and say, I really think you need to go talk to your doctor because you're not sleeping for days on end. You've got like this increased energy and these really explosive spurts. You're doing something that's dangerous, and I'm really worried about you. And so they would go in and describe these behaviors to their physicians, but the thing that they would leave out is they were using meth. Okay? And so sometimes what we see are mental health issues that get described as mental health issues, but they're masked by substance use. And that was a really, at least in Nebraska, that was a really explosive time for meth use back in the late 90s. Not to say that it still isn't, but It was really reaching its peak back then, and so we were seeing a lot of women who were coming in on drug charges, but yet we're entering into the system with diagnoses of bipolar disorder. So this is a really important one to ferret out. And co-occurring disorders may not be identified, especially in people that are self-medicating. Okay, so having a serious mental health history, but people are using drugs to self-medicate. Why do you think it's so hard? And this is really true of people, especially who have significant trauma histories. But why is it really hard as a person enters into a treatment court setting, especially if it's a drug court setting? And we're trying to sit down with a person and help them and talk to them about the importance of getting on an appropriate psychotropic medication. Why can that be challenging?
Because what they've been doing has been, in some way or other, alleviating symptoms. Maybe the immediate response is, I'm feeling better, even though the long term is worse. I don't like the term self-medicating because it presumes that we're all good pharmacists and we're not. And so I don't use it, but that's what they, so you're telling me to stop using the substance that, gosh, I can function, I can do better, and I feel good. And you're not, either A, not going to supplant it with something else, or B, what you're giving me instead doesn't have immediate relief.
Exactly. I found something that works, so why is it that I should switch? So, exactly. What term do you prefer other than self-medicating?
Just using it and abusing substances.
Using substances. So, some of the common mental health issues that we see in drug court and other justice system environments, and really I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these next several slides. You're going to get copies of them. But what I have down here are very common things that we see, common behaviors or observations that we see within the justice system. And again, whether that's in a jail setting, in a treatment court setting, under the supervision of probation, when law enforcement is having contact with a person, etc. Some of the manifestations of these illnesses that we see when a person's justice involved, such as command hallucinations, or that we think the person is really being non-compliant with us if they're suffering from an illness like schizophrenia. Poor hygiene. I can't tell you the number of times that I go into a local rural jail because they have called about somebody who is suicidal, and I walk in the door of the holding cell, and at that moment the smell hits. And so again, it's not uncommon that the person is not aware of their surroundings and the fact that they don't smell good and they need to take a shower. And sometimes we place a label on that like, man, why don't they go take a freaking shower? And so really having that understanding that the person may not be fully aware of them or what's going on around them and their surroundings, to attend to some of these things that are critically important to surviving in the justice system, regardless of which piece of the justice system that they are involved in. So similarly, looking at symptoms of mood disorders, major depression within the justice system. Knowing that the suicide risk is very real and that we have to attend to that in a real way and not as though the person is trying to be manipulative. Their loss of interest in food and self-care, or not caring about their legal situation. Again, I've met with a number of people who have said, I don't care, go ahead and violate me. I'll go back. At least I'll have some place to be and people will feed me, rather than taking on that ownership and responsibility in the community. So it's very important when we're working with people with mood disorders that we take these threats seriously. And why do we see that the risk of suicide may increase after a person's been on medication and they're feeling better?
They have energy.
They may have the energy now to follow through. So it's very important as we are helping people within the treatment court setting, as they are getting assistance like being placed on appropriate medications and they're starting to feel better, that we are attending to that history, especially if they have a history of suicide threats and attempts, because now they may have the energy to follow through. Same thing with mood disorders. We talked a bit in the last presentation how the behavior of others can and does affect us within the justice system, people with trauma disorders. So we see how people that experience bipolar disorder, sometimes their talkativeness may be irritating, or we see that fluctuation between significant highs and significant lows, non-compliance related to symptoms of their bipolar disorder. I'm going to flip through through some of these so I can get to other parts of the presentation before we run out. But again, all of these are going to be on the handouts for you. Very familiar with substance use disorders in your settings within the treatment courts. All right, so this is the next part that I wanted to get to, and really where your work as treatment court professionals fit in with what we, how many of you have heard of the sequential intercept model before? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, have any of you ever gone through a sequential intercept mapping? Okay,
Missoula, Montana.
In Missoula. Okay, it wasn't too terribly long ago that happened, was it?
Was it like last May? Yeah, was it?
Okay.
Yeah.
Last May. Okay, good. So really, what the sequential intercept model does that you see up here is it takes a look at the way that most people, not everybody, but that most people move through the justice system in a fairly linear fashion. From, you see on the left-hand side here, in the community where a call may go into 911 or to dispatch that activates law enforcement to respond because somebody in the community is observing somebody that's exhibiting bizarre or dangerous behavior. So, you know, we hear about certain law enforcement models like CIT, Crisis Intervention Team Training, or a co-responder model where mental health and law enforcement are teamed up to be mobile to respond to people in the community. Moving all the way into if that person is taken into custody and not diverted in Intercept 1, that they are booked in the jail for their initial detention, and they'll have a first court appearance, which oftentimes is referred to as first court appearance or arraignment court. And then for folks that are going to continue into the justice system, perhaps they don't meet the bail requirements or don't have money to bail out, how they will stay in jail and then have the opportunities to perhaps be diverted either through a specialty court, which many of you work in, or through a dispositional court and then re-enter into the community and ultimately maybe under some form of supervision in the community. So it's really important to see that the sequential intercept model begins in the community and ends here in the community with the goal of helping people with significant serious mental health issues, with substance use disorders, with significant trauma histories, get linked and connected to appropriate community-based treatment services and supports that aren't cookie cutter in nature. Sometimes it's really easy to say, yeah, we can take all these people and move them over to agency X because there's capacity there to serve them. But one of the things that we know is that a cookie cutter approach often does not work for people who are even involved in the same program like a drug court because they have very, very different needs. And so finding that approach that is specific to their needs and services that meet those needs are critical. So you see here in Intercept 3, where you guys, most of you guys in the room sit at within the specialty court environment. What we also look at in Intercept 3, and the reason why I have this up here, is it can often be important, especially as a person moves through Intercepts 1 and 2 and into 3 and they spend time in jail, to really take a look at what is the mental health information that you are getting from professionals working inside of the jail that can be very important to help you make decisions about whether a person is appropriate to participate in your specialty court, but also what types of services and supports might they need to be connected with as they're coming out of jail and into your specialty court. So when we look at post-booking jail diversion programs, later phase, like what you guys are doing with the specialty courts, whether it's a mental health court, drug court, veterans court, etc., is we see varying models. Some of them are public defender-based diversion, serving multiple courts across the courts. Jail-based diversion, serving multiple courts, and then the importance of those in-jail services. How reliant are you guys in the room upon screening that's done within the jail setting and information? Can you talk a little bit about that just so I have a better understanding? Do you get a lot of information when the person is working their way into jail and into court and ultimately into your specialty court, or are you reliant kind of upon your own information collection?
We are starting to. Our new sheriff that was just elected this year decided to get a actual nurse. We got a grant so we can get a nurse for the jail, which we haven't had. And then she's been making referrals to mental health. But one of the things that's been running through my mind is, so nurse refers them to mental health comes up there and sees them, but it's mainly the people who are waiting to go to like the Montana State Prison, Nexus, Connections, Corrections, all that kind of stuff. And I'm just thinking of like a specific person. We just had graduate treatment court who I know in the last probably 3 months has had, I was on crisis call last week and there was a crisis call for this person, and I'm just thinking, so we dropped the ball somewhere in treatment court before she graduated to get her into mental health services, because we didn't realize that she had nobody knew that she had a brother that killed himself until she was in the last phase and started doing a bunch of stuff, like proactive stuff with the suicide awareness stuff that we were doing. And so now she's at the point where she actually has attempted twice, and there's nothing we can do as, you know, like she's done with everything as far as court and everything, you know, is confidential, so there's nothing we can do to reach out without making it seem like we know something. So I was just thinking in my head, like, I don't know if anyone else in here does this, but I was thinking, is there a way to like, I was thinking in my mind, it would be so easy to have everyone like in phase 1 of treatment court have to do a mental health eval. Like, because we don't have that mandated right now. We wait until, you know, we see signs or symptoms or stuff is starting to go bad, they're non-compliant or using more than regular, and then it's like, oh, we better tell them to go make an appointment. Well, then it's a month to get in, and so by then it's too late. And so I'm just trying to think like proactively how can we fix that? And I don't know if anyone, does any other court in here make them do a mental health eval first?
We are a mental health court, but we have
diagnosis.
So we have a GAINS, it's just like a trigger screen for
right,
mental
because
health
we screen
issues.
them for us, you know, we have a mental health screening form too as addiction counselors, and most of them, you know, fib their way through it. And so I was just wondering if it, like, because I know sometimes they don't sit in jail for very long, where people who are waiting to go somewhere have been sitting there for a while, and then the officers in the jail see the signs and symptoms and, you know, call or make the referral. But I feel like we're missing something somewhere in between the ones who are getting arrested and then directly diverted to the program.
Having just done the session this morning on screening, I think too many of our drug courts are not really doing the kind of initial screening that needs to be done in order to make some of these determinations. You really can't rely on the jail. You've got to have screening done, and you really need to use instruments to help you with that. And there are numbers of them if you want some. They're at our table out here. But it's very obvious that our drug courts, especially here in Montana, our screening is mostly around eligibility. It's not around clinical appropriateness.
Right.
So
I think that would, at our mental health office, we've tried to prioritize the drug court participants. And they have to have, our drug court, we have to have a mental health diagnosis before they come into the court. So we've done the testing and we've done an evaluation.
And see, one thing that we have one mental health office and only 2 counselors for the whole Richland County where we're from. And so even to call right now today, you're not going to get an appointment for 2 months out. But it just so happens that we now have another option that just started in the community. And so I was just thinking, like, this would be the perfect way to utilize that new person in the community, you know?
Absolutely. And it can be difficult too when you're looking at, this used to really, and I was the deputy director of the county mental health system, so the natural question would be, well, why didn't it change? It was always really frustrating to me, and we knew, because we were kind of the agency of last resort for people who had nothing in terms of health insurance and were reliant upon, you know, county benefits to help out, that a person would come in our front door and they would have to, and perhaps it was in crisis, and they would meet with somebody and they would tell their story. And again, oftentimes that involves significant histories of trauma, along with their serious mental health and or co-occurring issues. And then if they wanted to meet with a prescriber, they had to go tell their story again. And then if they were going to work with a therapist, they told their story again. If they were going to get linked to a case manager, they told their story again. And so as we see people move throughout the justice system and the behavioral health system, we know also, and again, it's unintentional, but that experience of having to tell what's happened to you time and time and time again can be re-traumatizing in and of itself. Okay, and it certainly is a good customer service. And so when we look at folks with serious mental health issues that are involved in specialty court settings, the more that we can share information, and link people to appropriate services and share that information, the fewer times that the person with a significant mental health issue has to tell their story and repeat that to strangers and to persons that they perceive in positions of authority can be really important to helping them along that road of recovery, especially as they're involved in the treatment courts and some of the collaboratives that you have. And so as we take a look at treatment courts across the country, now some of these come from data that's about 3 years old, others are from this year, but the approximate number of specialty courts that we see across the United States, and again, these will all be in the handouts that you have afterwards, but obviously adult drug courts is where we saw the genesis of the specialty court way back in the beginning many years ago. But we're seeing the rise of other types of specialty courts here, especially veterans treatment courts and tribal wellness drug courts and even co-occurring disorder courts. And what we did was, and I'm gonna just jump here to really the summary slide after this, but we had a chance 6, 7, 8 years ago to work with 11 what we called adult treatment court collaborative sites from around the country. And right now we're working with the next iteration or the next cohort, which is 17. Instead of being called adult treatment court collaboratives are now being called behavioral health treatment court collaborative sites. And there were some lessons that we learned from these courts. And so a jurisdiction would take their multiple specialty courts, their drug court, their mental health court, their veterans courts, and they would start to realize where they were kind of crossing paths without communicating. And oh yeah, we're all serving people that have mental health issues or have co-occurring disorders or some specialty population. And how is it within our jurisdiction that we can better coordinate the care and more appropriately refer people into the right court and make sure that we're not missing the boat and just kind of putting people into courts because there's slots there. And so the summary of all of this work with these treatment court collaboratives across the United States with multiple jurisdictions was realizing that judicial leadership was key. So you had to have a judge or judges that said this is an important issue in our community for these treatment courts to collaborate with one another and better serve people. Because again, another common factor that we see across the country with mental health courts, drug courts, veterans courts is typically you have a limited capacity. I mean, even if that capacity is 100 people, it's often not enough to serve everybody who could be eligible for your treatment court. That it's important to have regular meetings and communication of partners, and sometimes it feels like we're having another meeting just to have another meeting. But those meetings, if they're used appropriately, are critical in terms of having the courts communicate with one another and better serve people with your limited capacity. The realization that evidence-based practices take time to implement and that there needs to be a continuum of treatment resources. That again, you can't just stick people where there's an open slot at, that there's got to be a continuum of care to meet people's treatment needs. Peer staff, how many of you are using mentors or peer supports within your treatment court settings? Good. Because again, one of the things that we're finding from the research that's being done is people with lived experience, a person that's been there, done that can offer, hey, I've been in your shoes, let me work with you in terms of how to get here, can be critical to the success of people that are involved in specialty courts. That services and supervision need to account for co-occurring disorders. Again, this was a huge lesson that came out of the treatment courts because they got together and realized we're serving the same people. This person was even in your mental health court, now they're in my drug court. Okay, so understanding that, and then the flexibility in individual treatment plans are necessary, and also looking at the use of graduated sanctions if people commit a technical violation where it's appropriate to try to help divert them from going back into the criminal justice system. So what are some of the consequences that specialty courts must consider when you're working with people with serious mental health issues? Now again, how many of you are serving individuals in your treatment courts that are convicted of felonies? Okay. And do you require the person to plead guilty to a felony offense before they can be in your treatment court? Okay, some of you are going like this, some of you are going like that, but here are some things to consider if your court is working, especially with felony offenders, and you're requiring them to plead guilty. And again, I'm probably not sharing anything with you here that you haven't already thought about, but again, when we're all over the country, so as we're working with communities, here are common issues that are brought up. Is Montana ban the box state?
No.
Okay, so that for those of you that aren't familiar with it, that box that says, have you been convicted of a felony when you apply for a job? And oftentimes, what we know happens is you check that box and you're never considered after that. So a lot of states have moved to ban the box. Now that doesn't mean that that question won't be asked when the person's being interviewed, but at least it's not going to be a consideration to throw their application out and not be interviewed for a position. We know that there can be difficulties with housing when a person's a convicted felon. Okay? And other issues that you see on here, voting, student loans, federal benefits, food stamps, TANF, etc. So these are all considerations that specialty courts, especially drug courts, mental health courts, and veterans courts have to take into consideration, depending upon whether your court is a post-conviction or if charges can be held in abeyance, whatever that looks like for your court. So what are some of the common gaps that we see in Intercept 3 where you work at, both at the jail level, but also at the specialty court level? So within the jails across the country, we see significant gaps in lack of screening for veterans and military service, a real significant lack in many pockets of the country with medication continuity. So a person comes in, they get on medications, and now they're getting ready to get out, and there may not only be nothing when they get out, but it can also take a significant period of time for the person to get in to see a prescriber for medication that they were taking in the jail. Obviously, there's formulary considerations. If I was taking one medication in the community and now I'm in jail, the formulary doesn't allow me to take that medication, so I have to go on something else. We know that there's insufficient data about the population of folks with significant mental health issues that are in the jail. For some jails, it's just an estimate of how many people, or it's based on psychotropic medications that are being prescribed to people. Within the courts, now this is not a knock on treatment courts, so I want you to understand this, okay, when I say this, but we see many jurisdictions that have an over-reliance on treatment courts. I can think of one in Mississippi that I was in back in late August, early September, that wasn't doing a lot with their law enforcement or early diversion opportunities, meaning at that point of arraignment, because they said, we've got all these specialty courts that people can be diverted into. Well, one of the things that we know is that people who are low risk to their communities, meaning from a safety perspective, that the longer they spend in jail, even up to 3 or 4 days, they're 40% more likely to recidivate back into the justice system before the case is ever resolved. Okay, so, yes?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. That people who are low risk to reoffend, and from a safety standpoint in the community, that even spending up to 3 to 4 days in jail, they are 40% more likely to reoffend before their case is disposed of. Before they even go to trial for that case, I should say. We see only misdemeanor or only felony courts. Again, based on some of the work that we've done with specialty courts that are working with folks that have serious mental health issues. I had one gentleman who was talking about their veterans court. He said, but here's the problem that we have. I had a veteran come up to me the other day when I came into jail to check about eligibility for our veteran court because they were only serving folks convicted of felonies, and he was being charged with a misdemeanor. He said, is there any way I can try to plead up to a felony so I can get out through the veterans court? So it's really important if you are only serving one level of offense or another to take into consideration the limitations that can pose within the jurisdiction. And then co-occurring disorders not being completely understood within that system. So if I were to say to you, in your role with specialty courts, if I were to say to you that good reentry planning is a matter of life and death, would I be being overly dramatic or not? Okay. So what we saw from, and this study is a little bit dated, but in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 2007 followed over 30,000 people that were released from prison in Washington State. 443 of them died within a follow-up period of 1.9 years, which was a death rate that was 3.5 times higher than the general population. And within the first 2 weeks of release, the death rate was almost 13 times higher for inmates who had serious mental illness versus those inmates that did not. And the leading causes of death were heart disease, homicide, and suicide, okay, following drug overdose. Okay, so again, with the work that you're doing, especially with the drug court settings and people with co-occurring disorders, realizing that folks with serious mental health issues that are coming out and dealing with co-occurring disorders and some of the risks that go along with that, it's really critical to have a good release plan in place as that person is coming back into the community, okay? So, again, what makes this complex is that within the context of your specialty court, you are dealing with people who have multiple needs, and they're significant needs. Okay, again, sometimes they're things that we take for granted day in and day out, but how many of you are familiar with that bottom rung of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? What's on that bottom rung? So knowing where my next meal is coming from, those basic needs, that I have semi-clean clothes to wear, a safe place to sleep, and that oftentimes the folks that we're serving within our specialty courts are involved in multiple systems. You know, I've often said, even as a person who's not dealing with, at least I hope I'm not dealing with significant mental health issues and I can navigate things fairly well, if I had to navigate all of these systems in the community that I've been living in for 25 years, I'd have a hard time doing it. Now imagine some of the issues that the folks we're working with in our specialty court environments are dealing with day in and day out. So having systems navigators, boundary spanners, peers, people that can help people meet their basic needs is critical to success within a treatment court setting.
Add to that the fact that they don't even have identification.
No kidding, no kidding.
And you can't do anything with any of this stuff.
You don't have $20
anymore
to buy it.
until they have identification. You know, even the food bank, our food bank, everything requires ID. So that's a huge thing when they first come.
It's massive. It's massive. So yeah, so a long time ago when I showed, does anybody recognize which Batman this is? Who is it?
That's Adam West.
It's Adam West, the first Batman. And so, yeah, it's Adam West. And so the first time that I showed this to some of my nieces and nephews, the first question was, who's the fat Batman? And the second question is, why is there a cord attached to that? So again, and this is in your slides, we're not going to spend time going through this, but some of the considerations that specialty courts have to take into consideration as people are re-entering back into the community. I think it's important also that we talk about some of the major risk factors for recidivism as we divert people through treatment courts. And oftentimes we refer to these as the big four and the moderate four. So the moderate four in and of themselves are not predictors of recidivating back into the justice system. And we can see how these are even things that if there are positives related to them, like good family circumstances, being employed, going to school, having healthy recreational or leisure activities, and not using substances, how those can be, you know, in the last presentation we talked about resiliency, but these can be resiliency factors that help a person to maintain in the community. And we've gotten really good, especially people that have clinical training, we've gotten really good when we're working with people, working with them on those moderate four factors, but the big four factors that can be in and of themselves predictive of recidivism, you can see most of them are tied into antisocial behaviors or thinking or peers that are predictive of recidivism rates. We haven't always done a good job historically, whether it's in the treatment court setting or in clinical settings, of having the expertise to attend to these big four risk factors for recidivism. And so the last thing that we want to do is link people to treatment and services that are focused only on these areas, because then really what we're doing is we're helping people become better criminals. Okay? Healthier, better criminals without getting to some of the things that put them at risk for recidivism. So there's obviously many models that we can take a look at surrounding risks for recidivism and helping people meet their needs, but the R&R, risk, needs, responsivity, and really what I want to tend to in this slide is this, and it gets back to what I talked about earlier within your specialty court environment, and that is not directing people just to the services that are available, but the services that are responsive to what their needs are, and here's why. Just as dangerous as it is to take somebody whose level of need is up here and to plug them into a service that's down here, it's just as dangerous when we talk about recidivism and the likelihood of returning to the justice system, to take somebody whose need for services is down here and plug them into something that's up here. We're not meeting their needs. We're not being responsive to what their needs are. related to their mental health issues, their substance use issues, their trauma needs, their criminal thinking, etc. And so we look at the risk need matrix of low need, low risk, all the way through high need, high risk down here in this quadrant. You recognize some of these characters? When we look at low risk, low need, who's that? Paul Newman, and what was the movie?
Cool Hand.
Cool Hand Luke? Okay. So what we're looking at in Paul Newman's character, where he played Cool Hand Luke, was really somebody who was engaged in petty criminal behavior. So this is a person that, as we were looking at, if we were going to divert him through a specialty court, which most likely we wouldn't do, is somebody who doesn't have high supervision needs in the community or high treatment needs. As we move across here to high risk but low need, who's this guy? No, it's not Rocky. Who is it? Robert De Niro, and the movie is Cape Fear. Cape Fear.
Oh, yeah.
He was a bad, scary dude in the movie Cape Fear. Very,
The movie was terrifying.
very dangerous.
Have you seen it?
And so he's a person that, if we were to divert him into the community, would need to have high supervision needs in the community, but isn't going to be very responsive to treatment. Okay. How about down here, under low risk but high need? Robin Williams. What was the movie?
Fisher King.
Fisher King. Very good. Robin Williams in the movie Fisher. Now, Robin scared people in this movie because his behavior was bizarre. People didn't understand it. Caused confusion, fear, angst. He wasn't dangerous to people in the community, though. So while Robin might have high treatment needs in the movie that he played in, or the character he played in Fisher King, he doesn't have high supervision needs. This one may be a little tougher to recognize. This is Andrew Goldstein out of New York, who is responsible for the creation of Kendra's Law. Andrew had command hallucinations that told him to push a woman named Kendra in front of a moving subway, which he did, and she was hit and she was killed. So he was responsible for the creation of the assisted outpatient treatment laws within the state of New York. If he were to get out within one of your specialty courts, your treatment court settings, he would not only have high treatment needs, but also high supervision needs in the community. So as we look at risk needs and responsivity of persons with significant mental health issues within your specialty courts, it's really important to match people appropriately with their supervision and their treatment needs. And again, that's nothing that you all aren't familiar with. This is not a good strategy to help people out of the justice system in the community. All right, we don't want to set people up for failure. And so just some really basic things about communication. A lot of these, again, get back to what we talked about in an earlier presentation this afternoon about how do we respond to people as though everybody we come into contact with has a history of trauma. Okay? We respond in an empathic, warm, and genuine manner to people, treating them as fellow human beings with respect, promoting communication by listening, clarifying. It's okay to have silence. Sometimes it's not a bad thing to have the person think about what was just thrown out there that they said or you said, to respond back to them effectively, to give them that personal space that we talked about earlier, to ask open-ended questions, to use our nonverbal cues like nodding and prompting somebody to continue on with what they're saying. Some basic communication guidelines, which I'm not going to read through to you because you can take the time to read them. But again, they convey respect, they give the person choice, provide information to the person as they need it, offer safety to individuals that they are working with. Some different types of nonverbal communication. You can read through those. So in the community, success is possible, but it's the understanding, since we're promoting recovery in people through treatment court settings, that symptoms and relapses will likely occur. We know that many significant mental health issues are cyclical in nature, that there may be times where we have to look at the use of graduated sanctions to help people maintain in the community and get the services and supports and help that they need. That we have understanding that recovery takes time and patience. And again, we're looking at if we're not already implementing a recovery-oriented model within our treatment court systems. Do you have to be a superhero? Yes, you do. What we want to see from that early slide on is actually a reversal of where many of our communities have ended up with adoption of the Mental Health Care Act, where we actually see people coming out of our prisons and jails and being connected with all of these services and supports and things that, again, we do on a daily basis, such as our jobs and the use of peer services to help people. We're not always the most helpful in the behavioral health system, though, so I want to leave you with this slide from 1896 to 1948, French poet. I have myself spent 9 years in a lunatic asylum and have never suffered from the obsession of wanting to kill myself. But I know that each conversation with a psychiatrist in the morning made me want to hang myself because I knew I could not sleep. So it's important that we try to do no harm. Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.